You see, Lincoln faced a whole set of challenging constraints during his war against slavery. The federal government was specifically designed to have little say over the states. The intention of the forefathers and the Constitution was to empower locals to make the laws that closely served their unique way of life, rather than having a distant national government enforcing laws that did not benefit the citizens that they were forced upon. However, slavery was the exception. On January 1st, 1862, one of the most historic executive orders ever passed by a president went into effect, the Emancipation Proclamation. Issued by President Abraham Lincoln in September of the preceding year, this proclamation brought the United States one step closer to embodying the concept of liberty and justice for all. The proclamation read,
"On the first day of January, in the year of our Lord, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States, shall be then, thenceforward, and forever free. And the executive government of the United States, including the military and naval authority thereof, will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons, and will do no act or acts to repress such persons or any of them in any efforts they may make for their actual freedom."
Now, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it didn't actually free any of the slaves in the states loyal to the Union. Ironically, the document only applied to enslaved people in the Confederacy. In order to be effective and, legal, the proclamation had to be presented as a military measure rather than legislation. But it also marked a big shift in Lincoln's publicized views on slavery in the Union.
Emancipation would redefine the Civil War. It was originally a struggle between the Union and the rebel states, Unionists wanting to preserve the national identity, and states wanting to preserve individual state power. But the Emancipation Proclamation turned the public consciousness from the struggle to preserve the Union and focused it on ending slavery. There were about 4 million slaves in the nation at that time, and the Emancipation Proclamation had the federal support to change the legal status of more than 3.5 million enslaved African Americans in the Confederacy. If you're wondering how the North could have legal power over slaves in the South, we'll get to that later. If a slave wanted to escape control of the Confederate government, their only hope was to run away across Union lines. Otherwise, they would have to hope freedom would come to them through the military advancement of the Northern Army. Ultimately, it was the Union victory these paths brought together, forcing the Emancipation Proclamation into effect in all of the South. Even though it specifically excluded the non-rebellious southern states, known as border states, the proclamation still applied to more than 85% of the 4 million slaves in the country. Somewhere between 30,000 to 70,000 slaves were immediately emancipated in the regions of the Confederacy where the Union Army was already in place. The Union did not have the legal power to enforce the proclamation in the areas still in rebellion. However, as the Union Army took control of the South, the proclamation gave actual legality for the liberation of the enslaved people. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 said that escaped slaves had to be either returned to their masters or held for eventual return.
Less than 100 years after its founding, the United States of America stood divided. Sadly, many slave owners in the South were not happy about the Emancipation Proclamation. As the Union gained support in America, the Confederacy turned abroad for aid. But Europeans that would have intervened to help the Confederacy did not want to be viewed as directly in support of slavery. This caused a noticeable halt in foreign aid for the Confederates. Meanwhile, the Emancipation Proclamation gave new hope to African American slaves. It became an effective motivator, inspiring many to escape from their masters and get to the Union lines as fast as possible. Many obtained their freedom this way, and then joined the Union Army to fight for the freedom of those they left behind.
The Emancipation Proclamation redefined the Civil War. Though the war began as a struggle to preserve the Union, the proclamation transformed the war into a fight to end slavery. In order to ensure that slavery was abolished in all of the U.S., Lincoln insisted that states require abolition in their new laws after the war. Lincoln encouraged border states to adopt abolition and began his famous push for the 13th Amendment.
The issue of slavery, like many issues, was originally delegated to the individual states. So for a considerable amount of time, the federal government's power to end slavery was limited by the Constitution. You might be wondering, did our Constitution really say that slavery was okay? Well, that question is what fueled the Civil War.
In examining the constitutionality of slavery, it should be noted that the explicit word slavery was not used in the 1787 Constitution. However, there were many references to unfree persons. The 3/5 Compromise allocated congressional seats based on the whole number of free persons and 3/5 of all other persons. Under the Fugitive Slave Clause, no person held to service or labor in one state would be freed if they simply escaped to another state. At the same time, many slave owners pushed for the counting of slaves for the sake of congressional seats. These slave owners were, in effect, acknowledging that the slaves they deemed as their property were indeed people entitled to the same freedoms of any citizen of the United States. This duplicity drew attention to the fact that the Confederate States were directly denying God-given rights to life, liberty, and property, which are promised by the Constitution in the Fifth Amendment.
Between 1777 and 1804, all but 2 northern states agreed with the abolition of slavery. This means that half the nation interpreted the Constitution in favor of freedom. But in a historic case called Dred v. Scott, the Supreme Court sided with the Confederate slave owners in their interpretation. With this backdrop, President Lincoln must have known that the Emancipation would never pass as legislation. So once the Civil War arrived, he issued the proclamation under his separate duty as Commander-in-Chief under Article 2 of the Constitution. He claimed to have the power to free persons held as slaves in those states that were still in rebellion, as a, quote, fit and necessary war measure for suppressing said rebellion. He did not, however, have commander-in-chief authority over the 4 slave-holding states that were not in rebellion: Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Because of this, he very purposefully did not include them in the proclamation.
Though limited by the Constitution, the proclamation provided the legal framework for the emancipation of nearly all 4 million slaves as the Union armies advanced. This committed the Union to the mission of ending slavery, which was a controversial decision even in the North. Hearing of the proclamation, more slaves quickly escaped to Union lines, while the Army units moved south. As Union armies advanced through the Confederacy, thousands of slaves were freed each day until nearly all were freed by the summer of 1865.
While the proclamation had freed most slaves as a wartime measure, it didn't make slavery officially illegal. In 1863, President Lincoln proposed a plan for the reconstruction of the captured Confederate state of Louisiana. The state was required to accept the Emancipation Proclamation and officially abolish slavery in its new constitution. The same type of reconstruction plans would also be implemented in Arkansas and Tennessee. Lincoln first discussed the proclamation with his cabinet in July 1862. His audience was speechless. After reading the first draft of his proclamation, Secretary of State William Seward finally spoke up, but not in the way Lincoln had hoped. Seward warned of the document's potential to cause anarchy throughout all of the South. Still, Lincoln persisted, dedicated to fight for freedom. And he found allies within his cabinet, like Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, who would one day spearhead the manhunt for his Lincoln's assassin. But that's a story for another day. Here's what you need to know.
Late in 1862, Lincoln asked his Attorney General, Edward Bates, for his opinion as to whether slaves freed through a war-related proclamation of emancipation could simply be re-enslaved once the war was over. Bates had to work through the language of the Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision to arrive at an answer, but he finally concluded that they could indeed remain free. Still, a complete and decided end to slavery would require an amendment to the Constitution. Conflicting advice to free all slaves or not free them at all was presented to Lincoln in public and private. Thomas Nast, a cartoon artist during the Civil War, composed many works, including a 2-sided spread that showed the transition from slavery into civilization after President Lincoln signed the proclamation. Nast believed in equal opportunity and equality for all people regardless of race and status. A mass rally in Chicago on September 7, 1862, demanded an immediate and universal emancipation of slaves.
A delegation headed by William W. Patton met the president at the White House on September 13th. Lincoln had declared in peacetime that he had no constitutional authority to free the slaves. Even used as a war power, emancipation was a risky political act. Public opinion as a whole was against it. But remember Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward? He eventually came around to Lincoln's side. Seward cautiously encouraged Lincoln to issue the proclamation after a major Union victory. And that's exactly what he did.
In September 1862, the Battle of Antietam gave Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation. In the battle, though the Union suffered heavier losses than the Confederates, and General McClellan allowed the escape of Robert E. Lee's retreating troops, Union forces turned back a Confederate invasion of Maryland, eliminating more than a quarter of Lee's army in the process. On September 22, 1862, 5 days after Antietam occurred, and while living at the soldiers' home, Lincoln called his cabinet into session and issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation.
According to Civil War historian James M. McPherson, Lincoln told his cabinet that he had made a covenant with God that if the Union drove the Confederacy out of Maryland, he would issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln had first shown an early draft of the proclamation to Vice President Hannibal Hamlin, an abolitionist, who was more often kept in the dark on presidential decisions. The final proclamation was issued on January 1st, 1863. Although implicitly granted authority by Congress, Lincoln used his powers as commander-in-chief as the basis of his proclamation. Some days after issuing the final proclamation, Lincoln wrote to Major General John McClernand.
After the commencement of hostilities, I struggled nearly a year and a half to get along without touching the institution. And when finally I conditionally determined to touch it, I gave 100 days fair notice of my purpose to all the states and people, within which time they could have turned it wholly aside by simply again becoming good citizens of the United States. They chose to disregard it, and I made the peremptory proclamation on what appeared to me to be a military necessity. And being made, it must stand. Initially, the Emancipation Proclamation freed only a small percentage of the slaves, those who were behind Union lines in areas not exempt. Most slaves were still behind Confederate lines or in exempt Union-occupied areas. Secretary of State William H. Seward commented, "We show our sympathy with slavery by emancipating slaves where we cannot reach them, and holding them in bondage where we can set them free."
The proclamation only gave the Lincoln administration the legal basis to free the slaves in the areas of the South that were still in rebellion on January 1st, 1863. It effectively destroyed slavery as the Union armies advanced south and conquered the entire Confederacy. You see, Lincoln faced a whole set of challenging constraints during his war against slavery. The federal government was specifically designed to have little say over the states. The intention of the forefathers and the Constitution was to empower locals to make the laws that closely served their unique way of life, rather than having a distant national government enforcing laws that did not benefit the citizens that they were forced upon. However, slavery was the exception. The Confederate States were directly denying God-given rights to life, liberty, and property, and Lincoln knew that federal intervention was necessary to end it. Ex-slaves contributed significantly to the Union military after the proclamation. Nearly 250,000 black slaves enlisted to fight for the North. Their contributions were massively significant and provided the necessary manpower to ensure victory. In a last-ditch effort, the Confederacy allowed slaves to fight in its army during the last months before its defeat.
Because the emancipation was a wartime measure, some Americans were concerned the measure would no longer apply once the war was over. To quell these concerns, Lincoln staked a large part of his 1864 presidential campaign on a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery once and for all throughout all the United States. This would be the Constitution's 13th Amendment. But rather than wait for the incoming 39th Congress, Lincoln pushed the 38th Congress to pass the proposed amendment immediately.
It was January 31st, this very month in history back in 1865, when the United States Congress passed the 13th Amendment by the needed 2/3 vote. This took place just about 3 years after the Emancipation Proclamation first went into effect. The 13th Amendment was ratified by the United States on December 6, 1865. Finally, with this landmark amendment, slavery and indentured servitude were definitively illegal in the United States. It goes without saying, the 13th Amendment was one of the greatest new beginnings in American history and absolutely fundamental to making America the great nation it is today.